The saga of Grettir the Strong tells us a lot. It was compiled in the 13th or 14th century, but it talks about events from much earlier, around the year 1010. Grettir was a real man, an Icelandic outlaw. He was known for his incredible strength and his very bad temper. He was also known for fighting the undead. The story that matters here took place at a farm called Thorhallstead in the north of Iceland. The farm was haunted. Its previous owner, a man named Thorhall, had died and was buried in a mound nearby. But he didn't stay buried. His shepherd was found dead, his neck broken. Then another farmhand vanished. People said a great evil had come to the farm. The new owner, a woman named Thorgerd, was desperate. She offered a reward to anyone who could deal with the haunting. Grettir, always looking for a challenge, took the job. He arrived at the farm and decided to spend the night in the main hall. He lay down on a bench and pulled a heavy cloak over himself. The night was quiet for a while. Then he heard it. A heavy scraping sound from outside. The sound moved along the walls of the hall, then to the roof. It sounded like something was walking on the roof beams, testing the structure. The timbers groaned under an immense weight. Then silence. Grettir waited. Suddenly, a pair of huge, hairy arms reached down through the smoke hole in the roof. The hands were like claws. They groped around in the darkness. Grettir didn't move. The creature on the roof seemed to get frustrated. It wrenched at the roof beams, and with a terrible crack, a whole section of the roof was torn away. A massive head looked down into the hall. Its eyes glowed in the dim light from the embers of the fire. This was the Draugr, not a ghost, but a physical body, reanimated and filled with hate. It was a walking corpse. The Draugr, a creature called Care the Old, saw Grettir and dropped into the hall. It was huge, far larger than a living man. It smelled of the grave. It moved towards Grettir. Grettir threw off his cloak and lunged at the creature. They wrestled. This was not a fight with swords or axes. It was a brutal physical contest of strength. The Draugr was impossibly strong. It grabbed Grettir and dragged him across the hall, smashing him against the wooden walls. The whole building shook. They crashed through benches and tables. Grettir felt his ribs might break. He knew that if the Draugr got him outside, he would be finished. The creature's power was greatest in the open, under the night sky. He fought back with all his might. He managed to get his arms around the Draugr's waist, but it was like wrestling a bear made of stone. They struggled towards the door. The Draugr tore the door frame from the wall as it tried to drag Grettir out. In one final, desperate move, Grettir put all his strength into it. He got his footing, pushed his back against a stone pillar, and bent the Draugr backwards. He bent it further and further, until, with a loud crack, the creature's spine snapped. But it wasn't over. The Draugr fell, but it spoke. It laid a curse on Grettir. It said that Grettir's strength would not grow any greater. It said he would be haunted by the Draugr's glowing eyes for the rest of his life. He would be afraid of the dark. He would become an outlaw, hunted and alone, and his end would come in solitude. Grettir, breathing heavily, took his short sword and cut off the Draugr's head. It was the only way to be sure. He placed the head at the creature's thigh, a traditional way to stop a Draugr from rising again. Then he burned the body to ash. Grettir won the fight, but the curse followed him. He was afraid of the dark from that day forward. He always had to have a light burning, and he did die an outlaw, alone, years later. The Draugr was defeated, but its malice lived on. Number 20. You never outrun the smell of burning seaweed. Magnus knew he had stayed out too long. The year was 1781. The place was the island of Sanday in Orkney. The islands were Scottish now, but the old Norse blood and the old Norse fears ran deep. The sun had set, and the mist was rolling in from the sea. It was a clammy, wet mist that carried the smell of salt and rot. He had been gathering limpets from the rocks, trying to get a few more to fill his basket. His wife, Elspeth, had told him not to linger. The nights were getting longer. The things that slept during the summer were starting to stir. He hurried along the shore, his boots sinking into the wet sand. The only sound was the cry of a distant gull and the rhythmic wash of the waves. Then he heard another sound. It was a wet slapping sound, a rhythmic squelch. It was behind him. He didn't want to look. Every child in Orkney knew the stories. They were told not to scare them, but to warn them. Don't go near the sea at night. Don't go near the shore when the storms are brewing. And whatever you do, if you hear a sound like a horse's hooves in water, run. Magnus started walking faster. The squelching sound got faster too. It was closer now. With the sound came a smell. It was a horrible smell. It was the smell of the sea, but wrong. You know, it was like seaweed left to rot in the sun for a week, mixed with the smell of a horse stable that had never been cleaned. It was a smell of decay and sickness. Magnus risked a glance over his shoulder. He wished he hadn't. It was the Nuckelavee. It was a thing that should not exist. It looked like a horse and rider, but they were one creature. The horse part was powerful, with fins on its legs and a wide, gaping mouth that steamed in the cold air. But the truly awful part was that it had no skin. Magnus could see the raw, red muscles and the thick, black veins that pulsed with some foul liquid. On the horse's back was the torso of a man fused to the spine. This rider had no legs. Its arms were long, so long that its clawed hands dragged on the ground. Its head was huge, 3 times the size of a man's, and it lolled from side to side as the creature moved. A single, massive eye burned in the center of its face, red and full of hate. Magnus screamed. It was not a brave sound. It was the sound of pure terror. He dropped his basket and ran. He ran for his life across the sand, his lungs burning. The creature let out a roar, a sound like a drowning horse. It galloped after him. Its breath was a plague. The old story said the Nuckelavee's breath could wilt crops and sicken livestock. It was called the Devil of the Sea. Magnus knew he couldn't outrun it on the open beach. Its speed was unnatural. He remembered the old wisdom. The one weakness. The Nuckelavee hated fresh water. It was a creature of the foul, salty sea, and pure running water was like poison to it. There was a small burn, a stream that ran from the hills down to the sea about a half-mile away. It was his only chance. He changed direction, scrambling over the dunes, away from the soft sand. He ran through the sharp marram grass, his feet finding purchase on the firmer ground. The thing behind him was gaining. He could feel its foul breath on the back of his neck. He could hear the wet slap of its muscles and the clatter of its hooves. He saw the stream. It was just a small trickle of water, barely a few feet across, but it was his salvation. He gathered all his remaining strength and leaped. He landed on the other side, stumbling and falling into the heather. He scrambled to his feet and looked back. The Nuckelavee stood at the edge of the stream. It reared up, its single red eye blazing with fury. It let out another horrible, gurgling roar of frustration. It could not cross. It paced back and forth on the bank, its long arms clawing at the sand. Stayed there for what felt like an eternity. Watching him with its malevolent eye, Magnus didn't move. He just stood there, shaking, until the creature finally turned and galloped back towards the sea, disappearing into the mist. Magnus never went near the shore after dark again. He never forgot the sight of that skinless body or the smell of rot and plague that came with it. On number 19, the weight on your chest is not a dream. The year was 1352. In a small village in Norway, the fear was a physical thing. The Black Death had passed through a few years before, and it had taken nearly half the village. Everyone had lost someone. Astrid was 17, and she had lost both her parents. She now lived with her aunt and uncle. They were good people, but the house was always quiet, always sad. The nights were the worst. For Astrid, sleep was not a release. It was a trap. It started the same way every night. She would be dreaming, usually a normal dream about working in the fields or fetching water. Then the dream would sour. The colors would fade. A sense of dread would creep in. She would realize she was in her bed. She would try to wake up, but she couldn't. Her body was paralyzed. She couldn't move her arms or legs. She couldn't even turn her head. All she could do was lie there, her eyes wide open in the dark. Then she would feel it. A pressure. It started at her feet and slowly moved up her body. It was a crushing weight, as if someone was laying heavy stones on her, one by one. Her breathing would become shallow, panic would set in. She would try to scream, but no sound would come out. Only a choked gasp, the weight would settle on her chest. It was immense. It felt like the roof was collapsing on her. She felt her life being pressed out of her. Sometimes she would see a shape in the darkness, a shadow darker than the other shadows in the room. It was hunched over her. Sometimes it looked like an old woman, sometimes it was just a formless mass. One night, she saw it clearly. A woman, pale and with long, dark hair, was sitting on her chest. She was just looking down at Astrid, a faint, cruel smile on her lips. Astrid fought against the paralysis with all her will. She focused on trying to move just one finger. It was an impossible effort. Finally, with a convulsive jerk, her hand moved. The spell was broken. The weight vanished. The woman was gone. Astrid sat up, gasping for air, her nightdress soaked with sweat. She told her aunt what was happening. Her aunt's face grew pale. She knew what it was. It was the Mare. The name came from the old language. It was a supernatural creature, a spirit that tormented sleepers. It would ride them like a horse, which is where the word nightmare comes from. The Mare was a shapeshifter. It could be a beautiful woman, a hideous hag, or even an animal. It would slip into the house through the smallest crack, a keyhole, or a space under the door. It would find a sleeping person and sit on their chest, stealing their breath and giving them terrible dreams. Her aunt told her the old ways to ward off the Mare. They placed a scythe by the door because the Mare feared iron. They carved a pentagram on the bedpost. Her uncle went out and found a mare stone, a small stone with a natural hole through it, and hung it over Astrid's bed. They even tried the simplest remedy, turning their shoes around before bed, so, the toes pointed away from the bed. The idea was to confuse the creature. For a few nights, it worked. Astrid slept peacefully. She started to think it was over. Then, one night, it came back. The paralysis, the weight, the terror. It seemed angry that she had tried to stop it. The pressure was worse than ever. She could feel its long, cold fingers tangling in her hair. The next morning, when she woke up, exhausted and terrified, she found a section of her hair was hopelessly tangled and matted into a tight knot. Her aunt called it a mare lock. She said it was a sign the Mare had been there, marking her as its own. There was nothing to do but cut the knot out. The Mare was not a ghost. It was not a dream. It was a predator that fed on the fear of the helpless. And for Astrid, the coming of night was the most terrifying part of her day. Number 18. The music from the waterfall costs more than you think. The Sven was a fiddler. He lived in the Telemark region of Norway in the early 1800s. He was good. He could make people dance until their legs gave out, and he could make them weep with a sad tune. But he wasn't the best, and he wanted to be the best. He wanted to play music so powerful it could charm the birds from the trees and make the rivers stop flowing. He heard the stories, the whispers from the old folks. They talked about the Fossegrim. The Fossegrim was a spirit of the waterfall. He was a master musician. Some said he was handsome, a young man who sat naked on the rocks beneath the water, playing a fiddle or a harp. His music was the sound of the waterfall itself, wild and beautiful and dangerous. The stories said you could learn from him. You could become the greatest musician in the land, but you had to pay a price. The Fossegrim demanded an offering. You had to go to the waterfall on a Thursday evening and throw a gift into the churning water. The quality of your lesson depended on the quality of your gift. If you threw in a skinny old goat, he might teach you how to tune your fiddle, but nothing more. But if you offered a fine fat lamb and you did it without looking at him as you threw it in, he would take your hand and guide your fingers across the strings. After that, your music would be magical. Sven was a poor man. A fat lamb was a significant part of his wealth. But his ambition was stronger than his sense of caution. He chose his best lamb, a healthy young male. One Thursday evening, as dusk was settling over the mountains, he carried the lamb to the biggest waterfall in the valley, a place called Rukkenfossen. The roar of the water was deafening. The spray was cold on his face. He was terrified. This was not a game. He was dealing with one of the old powers, the Vader, the spirits of the land. He stood at the edge of the deep pool below the falls. The water was black and swirling. He held the lamb tight. He closed his eyes, turned his back to the waterfall as the stories instructed, and threw the lamb over his shoulder into the pool. For a moment, there was only the roar of the water. He thought maybe it hadn't worked. Maybe he had just wasted his best lamb. Then a new sound mixed with the thunder of the falls. It was music. It was the most beautiful and complex music Sven had ever heard. It was the sound of the wind in the pines, the rain on the leaves, and the ice cracking in the spring. It was joyful and sorrowful all at once. A hand reached out of the spray. It was pale and slender. It was not the hand of a human. The fingers were too long. Sven, mesmerized, held out his own right hand, the one that held the bow. The Fossegrim's hand was cold as the water itself. It closed around Sven's. Sven felt a strange energy flow into him. He didn't see the creature's face. He just felt its power. The Fossegrim guided his hand, moving his fingers in impossible ways. It was not a lesson in notes or scales. It was a transfer of knowledge, of the music that lived in the water itself. The lesson lasted only a minute, but it felt like a lifetime. Then the hand was gone. The music faded back into the roar of the waterfall. Sven stumbled back to his village, his fiddle in his hand. He felt different. That night, at the local gathering, he played. The music that came from his fiddle was not his own. It was the music of the waterfall. People stopped talking. They stopped drinking. They just listened, entranced. He could play tunes so fast his fingers were a blur. He could play melodies so sad that the toughest farmer in the village wept openly. He became a legend. But there was a dark side to the gift. The music was not entirely under his control. Sometimes, when he played, the music would become wild, frantic. It would compel people to dance, whether they wanted to or not. They would dance until they collapsed from exhaustion. And sometimes, late at night, when he was alone, he would hear the waterfall in his head. He would feel a longing to go back, to stand by that black, swirling pool. The Fossegrim had taught him, but Sven had a feeling that the price was not just one lamb. The price was a piece of his own soul, which was now forever tied to the cold, powerful music of the waterfall. And number 17, a child's cry in the forest is not a call for help. It was a cold autumn evening in the deep forests of Sweden, sometime around the year 1650. A man named Lars was walking home. He was a charcoal burner, and his work kept him isolated in the woods for weeks at a time. He was heading back to his village for supplies. The path was narrow, and the tall pine trees blocked out most of the fading light. It was the time of day when the world felt thin, when the barrier between the world of men and the other world was at its weakest. As he walked, he heard a sound. It was the sound of a baby crying. It seemed to come from just off the path, deep in the mossy woods. Lars stopped. His first instinct was to help. Who would leave a baby out here? Perhaps a traveler had an accident. Perhaps someone was in trouble. He called out, "Hello! Is anyone there?" The only answer was the continued, desperate crying of the infant. He hesitated. His grandfather's words came back to him. His grandfather had been a charcoal burner too, and he knew the forest. He had warned Lars about the things that lived there. He had specifically warned him about the sound of a crying child. "If you hear a baby crying in the woods, Lars," the old man had said, "you turn and walk the other way. You walk and you don't look back. It is not a child, it is an ootbird." The ootbird, or myling, was one of the most tragic and feared creatures of the forest. It was the spirit of an unwanted infant, a child born in secret and left in the woods to die, unbaptized and unburied. The soul of such a child could not rest. It became a ghost, filled with sorrow and rage. It wandered the place where it died, crying out for its mother or for anyone who would listen. Lars stood on the path, torn. The crying was so pitiful, it sounded so real. His grandfather's warning felt like a silly old superstition. This was a real child, he thought. I can't just leave it. He pushed aside the branches and stepped off the path, heading towards the sound. The crying seemed to move as he got closer. It was always just a little further ahead. He pushed deeper into the woods. The light was almost gone now. It was getting hard to see. He finally came to a small clearing. The crying had stopped. In the middle of the clearing, he saw a small bundle of rags on the ground. He approached it cautiously. As he got closer, he saw it wasn't a baby. It was a strange, misshapen thing, small and pale. It looked up at him with old, sad eyes. It didn't make a sound, it just looked at him. Then it spoke, but not with a voice. The words formed in Lars's mind. Carry. Lars was frozen with fear. He knew now. His grandfather was right. This was an Utbird. The story said that the Utbird wanted only one thing to be carried to a proper cemetery and given a name and a burial. It would leap onto a traveler's back and demand to be carried. But there was a trick. With every step the person took towards the graveyard, the Utbird grew heavier. The little creature leaped. It landed on Lars's back with surprising force. It was light at first, no heavier than a small sack of flour. To the churchyard, the voice in his head commanded. Lars had no choice. He turned and started the long walk back towards the village. The creature's little hands gripped his shoulders. They were cold as ice. He walked for what felt like hours. With every 100 steps, the weight on his back doubled. Soon, it felt like he was carrying a full-grown man. His back ached. His legs trembled. He staggered under the load. The Utbird was silent, but he could feel its presence, its immense sorrow pressing down on him. The weight grew and grew. It felt like he was carrying a boulder. Then it felt like he was carrying a whole tree. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath. He couldn't go on. I can't, he gasped. The voice in his head became a shriek of rage. You will. The weight became unbearable. Lars felt his back was about to break. He fell forward, his face in the dirt. He felt the life being crushed out of him. He knew he was going to die there, in the dark forest, his back broken by the grief of a child who had never lived. The last thing he heard was not a child's cry, but a sound of ancient, bottomless despair. Word number 16, the spirits of the land were here first. When the first Norse settlers came to Iceland in the late 9th century, they found an empty land. Or so they thought. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, tells the story of these first voyages. It tells of men like Ingolfur Arnarsson, who threw his high seat pillars overboard and settled where they washed ashore. It was a land of volcanoes and glaciers, a harsh and beautiful place, but the sagas also say it was not truly empty. It was inhabited by the Landvættir. The Landvættir were the spirits of the land. They were not gods. They were not monsters. They were the guardians of the place. Every rock, every waterfall, every hill had its own spirit. They were the original inhabitants, and they were powerful. They were invisible to most people, but they were always there watching. The first settlers, coming from a land where such spirits were also believed in, knew they had to be careful. Well, they were not conquerors. They were guests, and they had to show respect. One of the first laws established in Iceland was a testament to this belief. It was recorded that all ships approaching Iceland had to remove the dragon heads and other menacing carvings from their prows. These figures, which were designed to frighten enemies, would also frighten and anger the Landvættir. To approach the new land with a snarling dragon on your ship was an act of aggression against the spirits who lived there. It was a challenge, and the Landvættir did not take challenges lightly. Imagine a man named Raffen arriving with his family around the year 900. He sails his longship into a fjord on the west coast. He remembers the law. As the ship nears the shore, he orders his men to take down the carved dragon head from the prow. As they wrap it in cloth and stow it below deck, he is showing respect. He finds a good spot to build a farm. He builds his house, his long house. He marks out his land, but respect was more than just one act. It was a way of life. And Raffen knew He could not just take what he wanted. He could not cut down a whole forest or dam a river without consequence. He had to live in harmony with the spirits. Before he plowed a new field, he would leave a small offering, a bowl of milk, or a piece of bread on a large, strange-looking rock at the edge of the field. This rock, he believed, was a home for the local landvatir. It was a small gesture, but it meant, I see you. I respect your home. Please allow me to use this land. His neighbor, a man named Bjarni, was not so careful. Bjarni was a loud, arrogant man. He thought the stories of the landvatir were for children. He laughed at Hrafn for leaving out milk for a rock. He took the best land for himself, right by a beautiful waterfall. He built a large, impressive longhouse, and he made a lot of noise. He and his men would have loud, drunken parties. They would throw their garbage into the river that fed the waterfall. One day, Bjarni decided a large, oddly shaped boulder was in the way of his new sheep pen. He ordered his men to break it apart with hammers and levers. That's when things started to go wrong for Bjarni. A strange sickness took his sheep. They grew thin and died for no reason. His prize cow, which gave the best milk, went dry overnight. The river, which had always been full of fish, seemed to become empty. A series of small, unfortunate accidents plagued his farm. A tool would break at a crucial moment. A fence would collapse, letting the remaining livestock wander off. As Bjarni grew angry and frustrated, he blamed his bad luck. He blamed his farmhands. He never once thought he had offended the spirits of the place he had so rudely invaded. Hrafn's farm, meanwhile, prospered. His animals were healthy. His crops grew well. He had no strange accidents. He continued his small rituals of respect. He lived quietly. He understood he was not the master of this new land. The landvatir were not evil. They were protective. They were the immune system of the land itself. If you were a sickness, a blight, they would work to remove you. If you lived with respect, they would tolerate you and maybe even help you. Bjarni eventually gave up. He sold his farm for a pittance and sailed back to Norway, cursing Iceland as a cursed land. Hrafn stayed, and his family lived on that land for generations. He knew the land was not cursed, it was just guarded. Number 15. Her back is a hollow, rotting tree. Eric was a hunter. He lived in a remote part of Sweden in the 1700s. He knew the forest better than he knew the faces of his own cousins in the village. He knew the tracks of the elk and the call of the capercaillie. He also knew the stories about the Skogsra. The name meant forest ruler. She was a type of huldra, a spirit of the woods. She was said to be incredibly beautiful, a woman who would appear to lone men in the forest. She would have long flowing hair and eyes that promised secrets. She could be helpful. If a hunter treated her with respect, she might lead him to the best hunting grounds or blow down the barrel of his rifle to ensure a perfect shot. But she was also dangerous. She was a creature of the wild, and she was not human. The stories always included a warning. There were two ways to know you were dealing with the Skogsra. The first was her tail. Sometimes it was a cow's tail, sometimes a fox's tail. But she always had one, and she tried to hide it under her skirt. The second and more sinister sign was her back. From the front, she was a perfect, beautiful woman. But if you saw her from behind, her back was not skin and bone. It was the hollow, gnarled bark of an old, rotting tree. Eric was a practical man. He didn't put much stock in the old tales. He thought they were just stories to scare children away from getting lost in the woods. One autumn day, he was tracking an elk deep in a part of the forest he didn't know well. He had been walking for hours and was starting to feel lost. The sun was getting low, and he knew he needed to find his way back soon. That's when he saw her. She was standing by a stream, brushing her long blonde hair. She was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She wore a simple green dress. She looked up and smiled at him. Her smile was enchanting. "Are you lost, Hunter?" she asked. Her voice was like the sound of wind in the leaves. Eric was captivated. He forgot about the elk. He forgot about the time, he walked over to her, they talked for a while. She was charming and witty. She seemed to know everything about the forest. He felt a powerful attraction to her, a pull that was more than just physical beauty. It was a kind of magic. She invited him to sit with her. As she turned to sit on a fallen log, her skirt hitched up for just a second. Eric saw it, a bushy red tail like that of a fox. A cold chill ran down his spine. The old stories came rushing back. This was the Skogsra. He was in terrible danger. The stories said that if a man gave in to her charms, she would drain him of his life force. He would come back to his village a different man, quiet and empty, his soul left behind in the forest. He would lose all interest in life and eventually fade away. Eric knew he had to get away, but he couldn't just run. That would anger her. He had to be clever. He remembered another part of the story. The Skogsra was powerful, but she was also tied to her domain. He had to show her he wasn't completely under her spell. He looked at her and smiled. You are very beautiful, he said. But my fire is going out. I need to get some more wood. He stood up and walked over to his small campfire, which he had made earlier. He acted as if he was just tending to his chores. He picked up his rifle. He didn't point it at her. He just held it. Then he did what the stories said you should do. He fired his rifle into the air away from her. The loud crack echoed through the forest. When he looked back, she was gone. There was no sign she had ever been there. The air no longer felt charged with magic. It was just the forest again. Eric didn't wait. He packed his things and started walking. He walked all night, and by morning he found a path he recognized. He made it back to his village, exhausted but safe. And he never told anyone what he saw, but from that day on, he was different. He was more respectful of the forest. He would leave small offerings of tobacco or a piece of bread by old trees. He knew the stories weren't just stories. The forest had its ruler, and he had seen her. He had looked into her beautiful, non-human eyes and had seen the ancient wild power of the woods. And he had been lucky to escape. Number 14, you should always leave a bowl of porridge for the Nis. On a small farm in Norway around 1880 lived a family. The father was named Kjell, and he worked the farm with his wife and 2 children. It was a good farm. The cows were healthy and gave plenty of milk. The horses were strong. The barn was always clean and tidy. Kjell was a hard worker, but he knew he had help. He knew about the Nis. The Nis, or Tomte in Sweden, was a small creature that lived on the farm. He was no taller than a young child with a long white beard and a pointed red hat. He was the guardian of the farmstead. He was usually invisible, but you could see the results of his work. He would groom the horses in the night, mend fences, and keep the barn tidy. He would watch over the animals and make sure they were safe. He was a protector, but the niece was not a servant. He was a partner, and he had a very specific set of rules. He demanded respect. You should never swear in the barn, his primary domain. You should always treat your animals well, and most importantly, on Christmas Eve, you had to leave him a bowl of porridge, a julegrot, with a large pat of butter on top. This was not a gift. It was his payment for a year of service. It was a sign of respect. Kjell's family always remembered the porridge. Every Christmas Eve, his wife would make a special bowl. She would use the best cream and put a big golden pat of butter right in the middle. Kjell would take the bowl out to the barn and leave it on a hay bale. In the morning, the bowl would be empty. And for the next year, the farm would prosper. One year, a new milkmaid started working on the farm. Her name was Hilda. She was young and thought the old ways were foolish. She heard the family talking about the porridge for the niece, and she laughed. "You leave porridge for a creature that doesn't exist," she scoffed. "What a waste of good food." On Christmas Eve, Kjell's wife prepared the porridge as usual. She gave the bowl to Hilda. "Take this out to the barn for the Nis," she said. Hilda took the bowl. She walked to the barn. On the way, she thought about how silly it was. The butter was the best part. She looked around. No one was watching. She quickly ate the pat of butter herself before leaving the plain porridge in the barn. The next morning, Kjell went to the barn to check on the animals. He found the porridge bowl. It was untouched. A A cold feeling of dread settled in his stomach. The Nis had been insulted. That evening, Hilda went to the barn to milk the cows. Kjell's prize cow, a gentle animal named Stirna, who always gave the most milk, kicked the bucket over. Then she kicked Hilda hard in the shin. Hilda had never known the cow to be aggressive before. Things got worse. Small, frustrating things started to happen. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in strange places. The horses' manes would be tangled in knots every morning. The barn, which was always so neat, became messy and chaotic. It seemed that no matter how much they cleaned, it was always dirty again the next day. The animals became agitated and unhealthy. The milk soured. An egg-laying hen suddenly stopped laying. The family knew what was wrong. The Nis was angry. He was not an evil creature. He did not wish them great harm, but he had a terrible temper. He was a creature of tradition and respect, and the insult of the missing butter was a serious one. He was no longer helping. In fact, he was now actively working against them, playing small, spiteful tricks to show his displeasure. The final straw came a week later. Hilda went into the barn loft to get some hay. As she was climbing the ladder, it suddenly slipped, and she fell to the floor, spraining her ankle. She swore she felt a small, strong hand push the ladder. That was enough for her. She quit her job and left the farm, convinced it was cursed. Kjell knew he had to make things right. The following night, he had his wife make the finest bowl of porridge she had ever made. She put 2 large pats of butter on top. Kjell took it to the barn himself. He bowed his head and spoke aloud to the empty barn. "We are sorry for the disrespect," he said. "Please accept this offering and watch over our farm again." He left the bowl and went back to the house. The next morning, the bowl was empty. The barn seemed cleaner. The animals were calm. The horses' manes were neatly brushed. The Nis had accepted the apology. The farm slowly returned to its former prosperity. The family never forgot the lesson. The Nis was a powerful ally, but a dangerous creature to offend. A small act of disrespect could bring ruin, and a simple bowl of porridge with butter was a very small price to pay for peace and prosperity. Number 13. The island that you land on might be alive. The year is around 1250. A Norwegian sailor named Halfdan is on a long voyage, heading towards Greenland. He is on a trading ship, a Mare. The journey is long and dangerous. The North Atlantic is a vast, empty expanse of gray water and gray sky. Storms can appear with no warning. Getting lost is easy. One day, after weeks at sea, they spot what looks like an island. It's not on any of their charts. The captain is cautious, but the crew is desperate for fresh water and a chance to walk on solid ground. The island is small and flat, with a rough, rocky-looking surface. There are no trees, just what looks like scrub and moss. They steer the ship closer, they drop anchor, and a few men, including Halfdan, row a small boat to the shore. The rock of the island feels strange under their feet. It's rough and knobbly, but also has a slightly soft, leathery feel to it. They find pools of fresh water and depressions on the surface. They rejoice, thinking they are lucky. They start to fill their water skins. One of the men, a young boy named Finn, calls out. He has found something strange. It's a large white object, curved like a horn, sticking out of the ground. He and another sailor start to dig around it, thinking it might be a walrus tusk or something valuable. As they are working, Halfdan notices something. The island seems to be moving. It's a very slight, gentle rocking motion, but it's not in time with the waves. It feels more like the slow breathing of a gigantic animal. He looks down at the ground. The texture of the rock looks like skin. He feels a deep, primal fear. He remembers the stories told in the book Konung Skugja, The King's Mirror, a text written for the Norwegian king. It described the wonders and dangers of the northern seas. It described the Kraken. The Kraken of the old Norse stories was not a giant squid with tentacles that attacked ships, like in later tales. It was something far stranger and more massive. It was a sea monster so enormous that it was often mistaken for an island. It was said to be the largest creature in the world. Sailors would land on its back thinking it was land. They would light fires to cook their food. The heat of the fire would disturb the creature. It would then submerge, dragging the unfortunate sailors and their ships down with it to a watery grave. "Get back to the boat," Halfdan screams. The other men look at him, confused. "It's not an island, it's the Kraken." The name itself strikes terror into the hearts of sailors. The men who were digging at the tusk drop their tools and run. They all scramble back towards the small boat. As they push off from the shore, the island shudders. The gentle rocking motion becomes more violent. The surface of the island begins to rise out of the water. Great torrents of water pour off its sides. The men in the boat row frantically, their hearts pounding in their chests. They look back in horror. What they thought was a rocky, flat island is now revealing itself to be the back of a living creature. The scale is impossible to comprehend. It is miles wide. The tusk the men were digging at was the tip of one of a series of enormous spikes on its back. The creature is rising from the depths. They can't see its head or its tentacles. They can only see its immense continent-sized back. As it rises, it creates a massive whirlpool. Their ship, the Mare, which was anchored nearby, is caught in the pull. The anchor is ripped from the seabed. The ship is spun around and around, drawn towards the center of the vortex. The men on the ship are screaming. Halfdan and the others in the small boat can only watch in horror. They row with all their might to escape the pull of the whirlpool. The great creature sinks back beneath the waves as quickly as it appeared. The sea churns and boils, and then it is calm again. The island is gone, and so is their ship. It was dragged down into the abyss, and Halfdan and the few men in the small boat are alone in the middle of the ocean with a few skins of water. They were the lucky ones. They had set foot on the back of the Kraken and had lived to tell the tale. But their survival was far from certain. They were adrift in the vast, empty sea, a sea that they now knew held monsters beyond their darkest imaginings. Number 12. A snake with the greed of a man is called a lindworm. In a small village in Sweden, nestled by a lake, there was a story that had been passed down for generations. It was a story from the 15th century about a farmer and his wife who longed for a child. The wife went to see a wise woman, a cloak guma. The wise woman gave her a small box with 2 seeds in it. "Plant one," she said, "but do not, under any circumstances, eat the seed yourself." The wife went home, but she was overcome with curiosity and hunger. She planted 1 seed as instructed. But then she ate the other one. In time she gave birth, but she did not have a human child. She gave birth to a lindworm, a monstrous serpent with a dragon's head and a long snake-like body. It had no wings, but it was powerful and grew at an alarming rate. As soon as it was born, the creature slithered out of the house and into the forest, where it grew to a colossal size. Years passed. The lindworm made its lair in the hills above the village. It became a terror. It guarded the main road, and no one could pass without paying it a tribute. And it demanded cattle and sheep. The village grew poor and fearful. The lindworm was not just a mindless beast. It had a cunning intelligence and a deep, avaricious greed, a greed it had inherited from the human seed of its mother. A young man in the village named John decided he had to do something. The village was suffering, and he was in love with the chieftain's daughter. The chieftain had promised her hand to any man who could defeat the monster. John went to see the same wise woman, who was now very, very old. She remembered the lindworm's birth. She told John how to defeat the creature. "It is a creature of unnatural birth," she said, "and it can only be defeated in an unnatural way. You cannot fight it with strength alone. You must fight it with cleverness and pain." She gave him a set of instructions. He was to demand 2 things from the village: a suit of armor covered in sharp iron spikes, and a huge number of logs to create a great bonfire. All John did as he was told. The villagers helped him. They built a massive bonfire near the lindworm's lair and set it alight. The heat was intense. Then John put on the spiky armor. He looked like a giant hedgehog made of iron. He took his sword and shield and went to face the monster. The lindworm was waiting for him. It was a fearsome sight. Its scales shimmered like dull green metal. Its eyes burned with a cold, greedy light. It was as thick as an ancient oak tree, and its head was the size of a small boat. It hissed, a sound like 1,000 snakes, and lunged at John. Instead of trying to fight it, John did something strange. He stood his ground and let the creature attack. The lindworm opened its massive jaws and coiled its body around him, intending to crush him to death. This was what John had been waiting for. As the lindworm squeezed, the sharp iron spikes on John's armor dug deep into its flesh. The creature roared in pain and surprise. It had never felt such pain before. The harder it squeezed, the deeper the spikes went. It tried to uncoil, but John was now inside its grip. It thrashed about, trying to shake him off, but the spikes held him fast. It was being torn apart from the inside of its own coils. In its agony, it rolled and thrashed, getting closer and closer to the giant bonfire. With a final, desperate convulsion, the lindworm rolled right into the heart of the fire. The flames roared up, engulfing the beast. The creature's scales, which were proof against any sword, began to cook and crack in the intense heat. It let out one last terrible scream and then was still. John, protected by his armor, managed to crawl out of the flames, scorched and exhausted, but alive. He had defeated the lindworm not by being stronger, but by using the creature's own strength and aggression against it. The village was saved. John married the chieftain's daughter. But the story served as a permanent warning. Greed and impatience, like the mother eating the forbidden seed, could give birth to monsters. And some monsters were not born of gods or magic, but of simple human failings. At number 11, the glowing pig on the road is an omen of death. In the southern part of Sweden, in the province of Småland, the land is dark and forested. The roads between villages are long and lonely. In the 19th century, travel at night was something to be avoided. It wasn't just robbers or wolves you had to worry about. There were other things on the road, things like the glosso. The glosso was a supernatural pig. The name comes from glod so, which means ember sow. It was the ghost of a sow, but it was far more terrifying than that sounds. It was said to be huge, with a bristly back that was as sharp as a saw. Its eyes glowered in the dark like red-hot coals. Sometimes it was described as being on fire itself, a walking inferno in the shape of a pig. The glosso was a creature of vengeance and bad omens. It was often seen on roads where a terrible event had happened. Its most fearsome trait was its speed. It could run faster than any horse. It would appear suddenly on the road in front of a traveler. Its purpose was simple: to run between the traveler's legs. If it succeeded, the person was marked. They would die soon after, usually from a sudden, violent accident. A farmer named Sten was returning home late one night. He had been at a market in the next town and was walking the familiar road back to his farm. It was a moonless night, and the forest on either side of the road was a wall of blackness. He was a brave man, not easily spooked, but even he felt a sense of unease on that dark road. He heard a sound behind him. It was a snorting, grunting sound, and the sound of something heavy running fast. He turned, and his heart froze. Bounding down the road towards him was a pig. But this was no ordinary farm animal. It was massive, bigger than any pig he had ever seen, and it was glowing. A faint, sickly light seemed to emanate from its body. Its eyes were two burning points of red light. Sten knew immediately what it was. The glosso. His grandmother had told him stories. He knew he was in mortal danger. The creature was coming for him, its hooves thundering on the hard-packed dirt road. He knew he couldn't outrun it. His grandmother's story had included one piece of advice, one desperate chance for survival. You had to close your legs. You had to press them together as tightly as you could, so the creature could not pass between them. The glowing pig was almost upon him. It was moving at an incredible speed. Sten stood his ground in the middle of the road. He planted his feet firmly and squeezed his legs together with all his might. He shut his eyes, bracing for impact. The creature hit him. The force was like being struck by a charging bull. He was thrown to the ground. He felt a searing pain along his back as the creature's sharp, bristly spine scraped against him as it tried to force its way through. But his stance held. The glosso, unable to pass between his legs, was forced to go around him. Sten lay on the ground, his back feeling like it had been raked with a hot iron. He opened his eyes just in time to see the glowing pig disappear down the road, vanishing into the darkness as suddenly as it had appeared. He lay there for a long time, shaken. He was hurt, but he was alive. He had survived. He slowly got to his feet and limped the rest of the way home. When he got there, his wife saw his face, pale as a ghost, and the long, bloody scratches on his back. He told her what had happened. They burned his clothes and washed the wounds with holy water. Sten lived for many more years. But he carried the scars on his back for the rest of his life. And he never, ever walked on a country road after dark again. He knew he had come face to face with an omen of death, and had only survived through a combination of old wisdom and sheer luck. The Glosso was not a monster to be fought. It was a fate to be avoided. For number 10, some corpses are bound to their graves. Not all of the undead in Norse belief were like the Draugr Grettir fought. Not all of them could leave their burial mounds and terrorize the living for miles around. Some were less powerful, but no less dangerous. These were the Hogby. The name means mound dweller, like the Draugr. The Hogby was a reanimated corpse that guarded the treasure buried with it. But unlike the Draugr, the Hogby could not leave its grave. It was bound to its barrow. This made it a different kind of threat. It wouldn't come to your farmstead. It wouldn't hunt you down. You had to come to it. The danger of the Hogby was a danger born of greed. It preyed on those who would disturb the dead, the grave robbers who sought the gold and swords buried with Viking chieftains. In the 10th century, on the coast of Norway, there was a large burial mound that was famous in the local area. It was said to be the tomb of a great Viking sea king named Arnkel. Legend had it that he was buried with his sword, his shield, and a chest full of silver. For generations, no one dared to open it. People respected the dead, and they feared what might be inside. But two brothers, Olaf and Eric, were desperate men. Their farm had failed, and they were deep in debt. The stories of Arnkel's treasure were too tempting to resist. They decided they would risk the wrath of the dead for a chance at a new life. One night, under a new moon, they took their shovels and picks and went to the mound. The work was hard. The mound was huge, made of earth and stone. It took them hours to dig their way to the stone chamber in the center. The air grew cold as they dug deeper. A foul smell, the smell of old death and stale air, came from the hole they were making. Finally, their tools struck the stone cap of the burial chamber. With a great effort, they pried it open and lowered themselves inside with a rope. The chamber was just as the legends described. In the center, there was a stone throne, and sitting on the throne was a body. It was Arnkel. He was not a skeleton. His body was preserved, though his skin was blue-black and leathery. He was dressed in his fine clothes, and across his lap lay a magnificent sword with a golden hilt. At his feet was a large wooden chest bound with iron. The brothers were terrified, but the sight of the treasure gave them courage. Eric took a crowbar to the chest, while Olaf approached the seated corpse. I'll just take the sword," Olaf whispered, his voice trembling. He reached out and took hold of the sword's hilt. The moment his fingers touched the gold, the corpse's eyes snapped open. They glowed with a cold, dead light. The Hogby was awake. It let out a low growl that seemed to shake the very stones of the tomb. It was still bound to its throne. It could not stand up and walk, but its arms were free. It lunged forward, its dead hands grabbing Olaf by the throat. Olaf screamed. The Hogby's grip was like iron. It was impossibly strong. Eric, seeing his brother being strangled, forgot the treasure and ran to help. He swung his pickaxe at the creature's head. The pickaxe just bounced off the Hogby's skull with a dull thud as if it were striking stone. It had no effect. The Hogby ignored Eric. It focused all its malevolent energy on Olaf, the one who had dared to touch its treasure. So it squeezed, and with a sickening crack, Olaf's neck broke. His body went limp. The Hogby let him fall to the floor. Then it turned its glowing eyes on Eric. Eric was paralyzed with fear. The creature was still sitting on its throne. It could not reach him as long as he stayed back. But he was trapped in the tomb with it. The only way out was the rope they had come down on, and it was on the other side of the chamber. He would have to go past the Haugby to escape. He stayed there for hours, huddled in the corner, watching the blue-black corpse on the throne. The creature never moved. It just sat there, guarding its treasure, its glowing eyes fixed on him. It didn't need to attack him. It could wait. It had all the time in the world. Eric was the one who would run out of time. He would die of thirst or starvation in that cold, dark tomb. His greed had led him there, and the guardian of the grave would make sure he never left. The Hagbui was a trap, baited with gold and sprung on the greedy. Number 9. The ghost that walks again brings the plague with it. After the Christianization of Scandinavia, the old beliefs didn't just disappear. They changed, they blended with the new religion. The idea of the undead remained strong, but it took on new forms. One of the most feared was the Ganganger. The name literally means walker again. Unlike the very physical Draugr, the Ganganger was something in between a ghost and a zombie. It was the spirit of a person who had died with unfinished business, often a victim of a crime or someone with a deep grudge. The Ganganger was not a decaying corpse. It looked exactly as it had in life, solid and real. You could meet one on the road and think you were talking to a living person. But there was a profound sense of coldness about them, and their touch was deadly. The most terrifying thing about the Ganganger was how it killed. It didn't use weapons or brute force. It would pinch its victims. This stoning it nip or dead man's pinch would leave a blue mark on the skin. The victim would then sicken and die, often from a plague like illness. The Ganganger was a walking disease. The fear of the Ganganger was especially strong during times of sickness, like the Black Death in the mid-14th century. A story from this time comes from a remote valley in Norway. A man named Halvard was known in his village as a bitter and greedy man. He had cheated his neighbor Magnus out of a piece of land. The dispute was ugly, and the two men became sworn enemies. One day, Magnus was found dead. People suspected Halvard, but nothing could be proven. Halvard took possession of the disputed land. A few weeks later, the plague came to the valley. People were terrified. They barred their doors and prayed. One evening, there was a knock on Halvard's door. He opened it to find Magnus standing there. He looked exactly as he had in life. He was not a ghost. He looked solid. "I have come back for my land, Halvard," Magnus said. His voice was flat and cold, and Halvard was terrified. He tried to slam the door, but Magnus was unnaturally strong. He pushed his way into the house. "You stole from me in life," the Ganganger said. "You will pay for it now." Magnus reached out and pinched Halvard hard on the arm. Halvard cried out in pain. The touch was cold as ice. Magnus then turned and walked out of the house, disappearing into the night. The next morning, Halvard woke up feeling ill. He had a high fever. On his arm, where Magnus had pinched him, there was a dark blue swollen mark. And he grew sicker and sicker. His skin turned gray. Within 2 days, he was dead. The village priest said it was the plague. But the older folks knew better. They knew it was the dead man's pinch. Magnus had come back from the grave to claim his revenge. The story didn't end there, because Halvard had died with the Ganganger's curse on him. He too rose as a Ganganger. His spirit, filled with the same bitterness he had in life, began to walk the village at night. People would see him standing outside their windows, his face pale. Another villager, a woman who had spoken against Halvard in the land dispute, fell ill and died after claiming she had seen him. The fear in the village was palpable. The Ganganger was a contagion, not just of disease, but of hate. One grudge could spiral into a chain of death that could wipe out a whole community. The only way to stop it was to find the Ganganger's body, dig it up, and move it, often to a place outside the village boundaries, to break its connection to its old life. It was a desperate measure for a desperate and terrifying kind of haunting. Number 8. The three-legged horse you see at the church is not a good sign. In Denmark, the churchyards were places of quiet reverence, but also of deep superstition. They were the gateways between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and they had a guardian. This guardian was the Hellhest, the Hell Horse. It was a spectral horse, almost always described as having only 3 legs. It was an omen of death, sickness, and misfortune. The origin of the Hellhest is dark. It was believed that when a new churchyard was consecrated, a living horse would be buried on the site. The spirit of this horse would then become the guardian of the graveyard, the first one buried there. Its purpose was to watch over the dead and to warn the living of impending doom. The church's official gravedigger, the sexton, was often the one who was said to see it most. A man named Jakob was the sexton of a small parish church in rural Jutland in the 18th century. He was a grim, solitary man, as his job required. He had been digging graves for 40 years. He had seen it all. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. One summer evening, he was finishing up his work. The sun had set, and a thick fog was rolling in, covering the old gravestones in a damp shroud. He was locking the heavy iron gates of the churchyard when he heard a sound. It was the sound of a horse's hooves on the cobblestone path inside the cemetery. But the sound was wrong. It was an uneven gait, a trip-trap, 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 a 3-legged rhythm. Jakob's blood ran cold. He knew the sound. He had heard the stories from his father, who had been the sexton before him. He peered through the iron bars of the gate. Through the swirling fog, he saw it. A large black horse. It was limping slowly down the path between the graves. It had only 3 legs. Its eyes seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescent light. It didn't make a sound other than the eerie, uneven clopping of its hooves. The Hellhest was walking the churchyard. Jakob knew what this meant. It was a harbinger of death. When the Hellhest was seen, a great sickness or a series of deaths would soon follow in the parish. It was said that if it stopped and looked at you, you were the next one to die. If it breathed on you, you would fall gravely ill. Jakob did not move. He stood as still as a statue, hidden in the shadows of the gatehouse. He watched as the spectral horse made its slow, limping circuit of the churchyard. It seemed to be inspecting the graves, as if counting its charges. It walked past the new grave he had just finished digging for old Gudrun, who had died of a fever. It seemed to pause there for a moment before continuing on. The horse made its way towards the gate where Jakob was hiding. He held his breath. He could feel an unnatural chill in the air. The horse came closer and closer. He could see the steam rising from its nostrils, even though it was not a cold night. He pressed himself against the cold stone wall, hoping the shadows would conceal him. The Hellhest stopped right in front of the gate. It turned its head and seemed to look directly at him. Jakob's heart felt like it stopped. He was an old man. He thought his time had come. He stared back into those empty, glowing eyes. The horse stood there for a long moment. Then it let out a silent whinny, a puff of cold air that frosted the iron bars of the gate. It turned, and with its strange, 3-legged gait, it limped away into the fog and disappeared among the tombstones. Jakob let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He was shaking from head to toe. The horse had looked at him, but it had moved on. The omen was not for him, not yet. But it was for the parish. The following week, a terrible wave of influenza swept through the village. Again, it took the young and the old. Jakob was busy for the next month. He dug more graves in that month than he had in the entire previous year. Every time he worked, he felt the presence of the Hellhest, watching him from the fog, the silent, 3-legged guardian of the dead and the messenger of their arrival. Number 7, a ghost that moves boundary stones will never rest. In the rural landscapes of Norway, property boundaries were everything. A farmer's land was his life. The stones that marked the edges of his fields were sacred. To move a boundary stone, to steal a few feet of your neighbor's land, was one of the worst sins a person could commit. It was a crime not just against your neighbor, but against the community, against justice itself, and it was a sin that was said to follow you beyond the grave. The ghost of a person who had moved a boundary stone in life was called a Deildagas. The spirit was condemned to an eternal, restless punishment. It had to haunt the land, it had stolen, it could not find peace, its fate was to wander the fields at night, trying to move the boundary stones back to their rightful place. but it could never succeed. The stones were always too heavy, or they would slip from its ghostly grasp. The Dial-the-Gast would be heard at night, wailing and crying out in frustration. People would hear a voice on the wind crying, "Here is the right place! Here is the right place!" as it struggled with the heavy marker stones. Indian spirit caught in a loop of its own crime. There was a farm in the Gudbrandsdalen Valley that was said to be haunted by a Dial-the-Gast. The story was from the 17th century. The farm had a large, rich pasture that had been the subject of a dispute for generations. The current owner, a man named Ivar, was a prosperous farmer, but his grandfather Anders had been a notoriously greedy man. It was widely believed that Anders had, over the course of many years, secretly moved the boundary stones between his land and his poorer neighbor's land, slowly absorbing the best part of the pasture. Anders had died a rich man, but no one in the valley trusted him. Ivar, his grandson, now lived with the consequences. Every night, especially on stormy nights, the family would hear it. A mournful wailing coming from the disputed pasture. They would hear the sound of stone grinding against stone. Sometimes they would see a faint, shimmering light out in the field. No one dared to go out and look. They knew it was the spirit of old Anders, serving his eternal punishment. The haunting was a source of shame for Ivar's family. It was a constant reminder of his grandfather's sin. The crops in that part of the field never grew well. The cattle would not graze there. It was as if the land itself was soured by the presence of the restless spirit. One year, a traveling preacher came to the valley. Ivar, at his wit's end, confessed the story to the preacher and asked for his help. The preacher was a wise man, and he knew the old lore. He told Ivar that the only way to give the Dial-the-Gast peace was to right the wrong that had been done. The next day, Ivar and the preacher went out to the pasture. They were joined by the great-grandson of the neighbor Anders had cheated. Following the preacher's instructions, they found the boundary stone that was the source of the haunting. It was a large ancient stone. "You must move it back," the preacher said. "The living must correct the sins of the dead." Ivar and his neighbor put their shoulders to the stone. As they began to push it, a sudden, cold wind whipped through the valley. A low moan came from the air around them. It was a sound of immense effort and pain. The living men were pushing the stone, and the ghost of Anders, the Dial-the-Gast, was pushing with them, finally able to move the marker he could not move alone. They worked together, the living and the dead, and slowly, inch by inch, they moved the heavy stone back to its original, rightful place, a place marked on an old map the neighbor's family had kept. When the stone settled into its new position, the wind died down. The moaning sound stopped. A sense of peace fell over the field. The haunting was over. The Dial-the-Gast of Anders had finally found its rest, its crime undone by a later generation. Ivar had lost a piece of his best pasture, but he had, gained peace for his family and his farm. The story became a powerful lesson in the valley. Man's greed could echo long after he was gone, and some debts could only be paid by those who came after. Number 6. The Dark Elves lived below the ground and were feared by the gods. In modern fantasy, we think of elves as tall, beautiful, and wise. But in the original Norse sources, the elves were more complex and more dangerous. The poems of the Poetic Edda talk about different kinds of elves. The most mysterious and feared were the Dokkafar, the Dark Elves. They were also sometimes called the Svartalfar, or Black Elves. They did not live in forests. They lived underground in the dark earth in a world called Svartalfheim. They were described as being blacker than pitch. This might have meant their skin color, or it might have referred to their nature, their connection to darkness and the underworld. They were masters of smithing and crafting. They could create magical items of incredible power, but they were not friendly, helpful creatures. They were reclusive, treacherous, and had a grim, morbid nature. Even the gods treated them with a mixture of respect and fear. A story in the Skaldskaparmal, part of the Prose Edda, shows their character. The god Loki, in one of his mischief-making moods, had cut off all of the goddess Sif's beautiful golden hair. Her husband Thor was enraged. He threatened to break every bone in Loki's body. To save himself, Loki promised he would get the dark elves to make Sif a new head of hair made of pure gold that would grow just like real hair. Loki went down to Svartalfheimr. He went to a pair of dwarven smiths. The distinction between dark elves and dwarves is often blurry in the sources known as the Sons of Ivaldi. They were master craftsmen. They agreed to make the hair, but they didn't stop there. They also made two other magical treasures, the ship Skidbladnir, which could be folded up and put in a pocket, and the spear Gungnir, which would never miss its target. Loki, being Loki, couldn't resist causing more trouble. He took these treasures and went to two other dwarven brothers, Brokkr and Eitri. He wagered his own head that they could not make three treasures that were as fine as the ones the Sons of Ivaldi had made. The brothers accepted the bet. They went to their forge. Eitri put a pig's skin in the fire and told his brother Brokkr to work the bellows without stopping, no matter what. As Brokkr worked, a fly who was Loki in disguise bit him on the hand, but Brokkr didn't stop. They pulled out a golden boar, Gulenbursti, with bristles that glowed in the dark. Next, Eitri put gold in the forge. The fly came back and bit Brokkr on the neck, harder this time. Brokkr kept pumping. They pulled out the golden ring Draupnir, which would create 8 new rings of equal value every 9th night. Finally, Eitri put iron in the forge. He warned Brokkr that this was the most difficult task. The fly came back and bit Brokkr on the eyelid so hard that blood ran into his eye and he couldn't see. For just a second, he lifted his hand to wipe the blood away. It was a tiny pause, but it was enough. They pulled out a mighty hammer. It was Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. It was incredibly powerful, but because of that tiny interruption, its handle was a little too short. Loki and the dwarves took their treasures to the gods to be judged. The gods agreed that the hammer Mjolnir was the greatest treasure of all, despite its short handle, because it would be the best defense against the giants. Brokkr had won the bet. He had won Loki's head, but Loki was a trickster. "You have won my head," he said. "But you did not win my neck. You may take my head, but you cannot cut any part of my neck." The dwarves were furious. They had been tricked. They couldn't cut off his head without touching his neck, so instead Brokkr took an awl and a thong and sewed Loki's mouth shut to punish him for his bragging and his lies. This story shows the nature of the Dark Elves, or Svartalfar. They are not evil, exactly, but they are grim, proud, and obsessed with their craft. They live in darkness. They deal in binding oaths and wagers. They are easily offended, and they are vengeful. They were the secret blacksmiths of the cosmos, creating the most powerful weapons and tools for the gods, but they were not their friends. They were a separate, older, and darker power tied to the earth and the forge, a reminder that not all magic is beautiful or good. Number 5. The Church Grim protects the church with its life. In English folklore, there is the Church Grim, a guardian spirit. This belief has strong parallels and likely origins in the Scandinavian Kirkogrim. Like the Hellist, the Kirkogrim was the spirit of the first creature buried in a churchyard. It was its eternal guardian. While the Hellhist was often a horse, the Kirkogrim could take other forms, most commonly a large black dog or sometimes a lamb. In Sweden, it was said that the church lamb was a sign of a child's upcoming funeral, while the church sow meant an adult would die. The Kirkogrim's job was to protect the church and the graveyard from any sacrilege or evil. It was a fierce protector of holy ground. It would ring the church bells late at night as a warning of an impending death in the parish. Most people never saw it. Only the priest or the sexton were likely to catch a glimpse of this spectral guardian. A story from the Skane region of Sweden tells of a new priest, Father Nils, who came to a very old parish in the late 1700s. The church was ancient, a stone building from the 12th century. The graveyard was full of tilting, moss-covered stones. Nils was a man of the New Age, a man of reason. He didn't believe in the old superstitions. His parishioners would talk about the Kirkogrim, a great black dog that watched over the church, but he dismissed it as peasant folklore. One night, a terrible storm rolled in. The wind howled and the rain beat against the stained glass windows of the priest's house next to the church. In the middle of the night, above the sound of the storm, Nils heard the church bell tolling. It was a slow, mournful sound, just a single, repeated toll. He was annoyed. He thought some, village drunkard was playing a prank. He grabbed his heavy coat and a lantern and went out into the storm. He unlocked the heavy oak door of the church and went inside. The church was empty and dark. The bell rope was swinging gently as if someone had just let it go. But there was no one there. He was puzzled and a little unnerved. He secured the door and went back to his house. A few days later, 2 men came to the village. They were strangers, and they looked rough. They asked a lot of questions about the old church, about the silver candlesticks and the communion cup. The villagers were suspicious and told them nothing. That night, Father Nils was working late in his study, which looked out onto the graveyard. He saw a flicker of light near the church. He saw the 2 strangers. They had a crowbar and were trying to pry open the heavy sacristy door where the church's few treasures were kept. Nils was not a brave man. He was about to run and try to get help from the village. But then he saw something else. A shape emerged from the shadows of the oldest part of the graveyard. It was a dog. It was a huge black dog, bigger than any dog he had ever seen. Its fur was shaggy and the color of midnight. Its eyes glowed with a soft green light. The dog didn't bark or growl. And it moved in complete silence. The 2 robbers had their backs to it, focused on the door. The great black dog padded silently across the wet grass. It got right behind them. Then it let out a single, terrifying bark. It was not the sound of a normal animal. It was a sound that seemed to echo with the authority of the grave itself. The 2 men spun around and screamed in terror. They dropped their tools and ran. They scrambled over the low stone wall of the churchyard and disappeared into the night and were never seen in the parish again. The black dog watched them go. Then it turned its head and looked directly at the window where Father Nils was standing. It held his gaze for a long moment. Then it seemed to melt back into the shadows of the ancient tombstones and was gone. From that day on, Father Nils was a changed man. He no longer dismissed the old stories. He had seen the Fossegrim. He understood that he was not the only one watching over his church. He was just the temporary, living guardian. The true, eternal guardian was a silent, watchful spirit that had been there for centuries and would be there for centuries to come. Number 4. Not all dwarves stayed in their mountains. The Norse world was full of different races and tribes. We know of the gods, the giants, and the elves. But there were also the dwarves, the Dvergar. Like the dark elves, they were mastersmiths who lived underground. They were often portrayed as greedy, grumpy, and selfish. Most stories about them happen in their underground halls. But some dwarves left the mountains, and they could be just as dangerous out in the world. The saga of Hervor and Heidrek tells the story of a cursed sword named Turfing. The sword was forged by 2 dwarves named Dvalin and Durin. They were captured by a king named Svafrlami, a grandson of Odin. He forced them to forge a sword for him. It would have a hilt of gold, it would never rust, it would cut through iron as easily as cloth, and it would never fail to win a battle for its owner. The dwarves made the sword. It was the most perfect blade ever created, but as they handed it over, they laid a curse on it to get their revenge on the king for capturing them. The curse had 3 parts. First, every time the sword was drawn from its sheath, it had to kill a man. Second, it would be the cause of 3 great evils. And third, it would eventually kill Svafrlami himself. Svafrlami was pleased with the sword and ignored the curse. He used it to win many battles. One day, he fought a berserker named Arngrim. During the fight, Arngrim managed to cut off Svafrlami's hand. The king dropped Turfing. Arngrim picked it up and, fulfilling the 3rd part of the curse, killed Svafrlami with his own sword. The sword then passed to Arngrim's 12 sons, who were all fearsome berserkers. They went raiding across the north, and Turfing, true to its curse, killed many men. Eventually, they were challenged by a Swedish hero named Halmar. In a great battle on an island, Halmar and his friend Orvar Odd fought the 12 brothers. And Hjalmar, though mortally wounded by Typhing, managed to kill Arngrim's son, Angantyr, who wielded the sword. The 11 other brothers were also killed. Orvar Odd buried the berserkers in a barrow on the island, and he buried the cursed sword with its owner, Angantyr, to stop it from causing any more harm. But the story doesn't end there. Angantyr had a daughter named Hervor. She grew up to be a shield maiden, as fierce as any man. She heard the story of her father and his magical sword. She decided she would claim her inheritance. She sailed to the island where her father and uncles were buried. It was a haunted place. At night, the barrows were said to be surrounded by ghostly fires, and the dead were said to walk. Hervor went to the burial mound alone at night. She stood before it and called out to her dead father, demanding the sword. The ghost of Angantyr spoke to her from within the grave. He warned her to leave. He told her the sword was cursed and would bring destruction to her and all her descendants. He said it was not a fitting weapon for a woman. Hervor refused to be scared away. She taunted the ghost, calling him a coward for trying to keep his sword hidden in the grave. She persisted, her courage greater than her fear. Finally, impressed by her bravery, the barrow opened. A ghostly light shone from within. The spirit of her father appeared and gave her the sword, Turfing. And he warned her again of the curse, telling her it would be the downfall of her entire family. Hervor took the sword and left the island. The curse of the two dwarves, Divalin and Durin, continued. The sword did indeed bring ruin to her family. Her son, Heidrek, killed his own brother with it, and Heidrek himself was later killed by his own slaves who stole the sword. The dwarves' curse, forged out of bitterness and revenge, echoed through generations, proving that the creations of the deep earth could bring misery and death to the world of men. Number 3. The sea itself could be a monster. The Norse were a seafaring people. The sea was their road, their source of food, and their greatest foe. They had a deep respect for its power. They saw personalities in the natural world, the wind, the thunder, the ice. It is no surprise, then, that they sometimes saw the sea itself as a living entity, a giant. One of the oldest and most primal figures in the mythology is Aegir. Aegir was the giant, or Jotun, who ruled over the sea. He was not one of the gods of Asgard, but he was often on friendly terms with them. He would host great feasts for the gods in his hall at the bottom of the ocean. His wife was Ran, a more sinister figure who would drag drowning sailors down to her depths with a great net. They had 9 daughters, the Wave Maidens, who were the spirits of the waves themselves. Aegir represented the sea in its calmer, more social aspect. And he was the host of the party, but his nature was still that of a giant. He was ancient, powerful, and unpredictable. His friendship with the gods was always a little tense. He was a force of nature that could not be truly controlled. In the poem Lokasenna, we get a vivid picture of one of Aegir's feasts. All the gods are gathered in this hall. The hall is lit by glowing gold, not by fire. The ale serves itself, flowing into the drinking horns magically. The feast is a grand affair, but Loki, the trickster, crashes the party. He had not been invited. Loki proceeds to insult every single god and goddess in the hall. He accuses them of cowardice, infidelity, and all sorts of failings. The poem is a catalog of the gods' secrets and shames. Throughout this, Aegir tries to keep the peace. He is the host, and this is a breach of hospitality. He tells Loki to be quiet and show respect. But Loki is uncontrollable. This scene shows Aegir's role. He is the master of his domain, the deep sea, a place separate from Asgard and Midgard. The gods are visitors in his realm. While he is their friend, there is an underlying sense that he is a different kind of power, an older power. He is the personification of the vast, unknowable ocean. His wife, Ran, represents the other side of the sea. She is the sea's cruelty and its hunger. Sailors who drowned were said to have gone to Ran. Before a voyage, sailors would sometimes offer a sacrifice, a bit of gold perhaps, dropped into the water. This was an offering to Ran, to appease her, to bribe her not to catch them in her net. The 9 Wave Maiden daughters had names that described the different types of waves: Himingleva, the transparent shining one; Dufa, the pitching one; Blodeuhata the bloody-haired one, likely referring to the Red Sea foam after a battle, and so on. They were beautiful but dangerous like the waves themselves. The god Heimdallr was said to be their son, born of all 9 of them, a child of the sea itself. Aegir and his family were not monsters in the way a Dregger was a monster. They were something bigger. They were the personification of a natural force that could be generous one day and deadly the next. They were the reason the Vikings painted eyes on the prows of their longships, not just to see where they were going, but to watch out for the dangers that lived in the deep. They were a reminder that the greatest monster of all for a sailor was the ocean itself. Number 2, the Finnish god of war was a thing of horror. Norse mythology didn't exist in a vacuum. The Norse peoples traded and fought with their neighbors, and their beliefs sometimes mingled. To the east, in the lands of Finland, was a different but equally rich and dark mythology, and one of its most terrifying figures was Iku Turso. The name is old and its meaning is debated. It might mean the eternal Turso, or the thousand-horned. He was a malevolent god of the sea and of war. Iku Turso appears in the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala. He is a monster of cosmic proportions. He is described as rising from the sea. He is the thousand-headed, the beast of 100 heads. His appearance is horrific. In some descriptions, he has a beard made of pine trees, and his hair is of tangled reeds. He is a primal force of destruction. In one part of the Kalevala, the great hero Wainamoinen is sailing on a magical ship he has built. The sorceress, Louhi, the mistress of the Northland, is angry with him. She wants to stop him. She calls upon Iku Turso to destroy him. The monster rises from the depths. The sea begins to boil. He is a colossal beast who threatens to swamp the hero's ship. He is a personification of the terror of the northern seas, a place of ice and sudden violent storms. He is not just a sea monster, he is a god of war. His presence incites conflict and bloodshed. Wainamoinen, who is a shaman and a singer of great power, confronts the beast. He does not fight him with a sword, he fights him with magic and with words. He grabs Iku Turso by the ears and speaks to him, questioning him. Iku Turso, son of the old god, he asks, why have you risen from the sea? Why have you left your home to show yourself to men? The monster is surprised to be addressed this way. Wainamoinen then makes him a promise. He will release Iku Turso, but only if the monster swears a mighty oath that he will never again rise from the sea to attack mankind. Iku Turso, defeated by the hero's magic, agrees. He swears the oath and sinks back into the depths, never to be seen again. But the memory of him remained. During the Winter War in 1939 between Finland and the Soviet Union, the Finnish Navy had a submarine. They named it the Vatainen, and on its conning tower they painted a symbol, a kind of swastika-like figure with arms. This was the Tursensiden, or the Heart of Turso. It was an ancient symbol of luck and protection, meant to ward off evil. It was a piece of ancient, pre-Christian magic being used in a 20th century war. Iku Turso represents a kind of terror that is both natural and supernatural. He is the storm that sinks ships. He is the sudden, inexplicable violence of war. He is the chaotic evil that rises from the dark places of the world. Even though he was part of a different mythology, the Vikings who sailed the Baltic Sea would have known and feared the storms and the sudden violence that he represented. He was a neighbor to their pantheon of monsters, a creature born of the same cold, dark, and dangerous world. Number 1, the first being was not a god, but a giant made of ice and salt. Before there was anything, there was nothing. No earth, no sky, no sea. There was only a great empty void called Ginnungagap. To the north of this void was a realm of ice and fog called Niflheim. To the south was a realm of fire and heat called Muspelheim. For ages, these two realms existed in opposition. The cold winds from Niflheim met the hot sparks from Muspelheim in the middle of the Ginnungagap. The heat from the south melted the ice from the north. The water dripped and dripped, and in those drops, life began to form. It was not a god, it was not a man, it was a giant. His name was Ymir. He was the first living being, a colossal creature made of frost and rime. He was the ancestor of all the Jotnar, the giants. He was not good or evil, he just was. He was primal matter given form. From the sweat of Ymir's armpits, a male and a female giant were born. From his legs, a six-headed giant was born. This is how the race of frost giants began. As more ice melted, another creature was formed. It was a cow. A giant, hornless cow named Audumbla. Ymir drank the milk that flowed in 4 rivers from her udders. That is how he survived. Audumbla also needed to eat. She began to lick the salty ice blocks that were all around her. For 3 days she licked. On the first day, the hair of a man appeared from the ice. On the second day, his head was visible. On the third day, the whole man was freed. His name was Buri. He was the first of the gods, the ancestor of the Aesir. And Buri had a son named Bor. Bor married a giantess named Besla, the daughter of one of Ymir's descendants. They had 3 sons, Odin, Vili, and Vi. These 3 brothers were the first of the Aesir gods we know. But they were living in a world dominated by the giant Ymir and his ever-growing family of frost giants. The giants were chaotic and destructive. Odin and his brothers decided they had to create a new world, a world of order. To do that, they had to kill the first being, their own great-grandfather's ancestor, Ymir. They attacked the giant. The battle was immense. Ymir was the oldest and most powerful of all beings. But the 3 young gods were strong. They managed to kill him. When Ymir fell, so much blood poured from his wounds that it created a great flood. This flood drowned all of the frost giants, except for one, Bergelmir and his wife. They escaped on a wooden box, like a boat, and they became the ancestors of the new race of giants who would be the eternal enemies of the gods. Odin, Vili, and Vi then took the enormous body of Ymir and began to create the world from it. This is the ultimate act of creation in Norse mythology, and it is an act of butchery. They used his flesh to make the earth. They used his blood to make the oceans and the rivers. His bones became the mountains, and his smaller teeth and broken bone fragments became the rocks and stones. They took his skull, and they made the sky from it, placing it like a great dome over the earth. They put a dwarf at each of the 4 corners to hold it up. The dwarves' names were Nordri, Sudri, Ostri, and Vestri north, south, east, and west. They took Ymir's brains and they threw them into the air, and they became the clouds. They took the sparks that flew from the fiery realm of Muspelheim, and they set them in the sky to be the sun, the moon, and the stars. Finally, they took Ymir's eyebrows, and they used them to build a great wall. This wall surrounded the central part of the earth. This fortified place was called Midgard, the Middle Enclosure. This is where they would later place the first humans. Outside the wall, in a land called Jotunheim, the surviving giants would live. The most fundamental creature in all of Norse mythology is not a god or a hero. It is a giant born of melting ice, and the world that humans and gods live in is made from his corpse. Every mountain, every river, every cloud is a part of this first chaotic being. It is a world built on the foundation of a violent death. It is a constant reminder that in the Norse worldview, creation and destruction were not opposites. They were 2 sides of the same coin. The world was born from a monster, and it was always shadowed by the chaotic, monstrous forces from which it was made.